Hey everyone, it's Adam again, here with episode 2 of our video series. This one's going to cover the history of One World by Night. So first we're going to start off with White Wolf Canon. Now, what is White Wolf Canon? This is the world in character fantasy story that has existed for the game. It's a very long and varied history. It starts, obviously, for Vampire with Cain of the Bible slaying his brother Abel, becoming cursed by God, and becoming the first vampire as a result of that. Cain, in turn, eventually wandered what was called the Land of Nod to find the first city, known as Enoch. And there he kind of took it over and did what's called Embrace, turned 3 people into vampires. They were Arad, Aran, and Zilla. These were the first 3 vampires besides Cain themselves, and they themselves in turn had children known as the Antediluvians. They are the founders of each of the 13 clans. So for reference, Cain is often considered the first generation vampire, his children the second, and the Antediluvians the third generation. Generation in the game measures how close you are to the first vampire, and the third made the fourth made the fifth, so on and so forth. All the way down to the now 16th generation of vampires. And the further you get from Cain, the weaker you are. So I'm not going to kind of cover the history of vampires in the World of Darkness. That's kind of on the wiki that I referenced, or in the books that you can go into, but there's a varying long history of what happened to vampires over millennia alongside humanity as it grew. We're kind of focused on what's called the modern nights. This is going to be the 90s and going forward. For the most part, One World by Night followed the White Wolf canon. The continuation of the story from 2nd edition through revised all the way until they ended the game line with Gehenna in 2004. So the 90s to about 2004 is the canon that we followed straight, almost identically from the books itself. After 2004 and the game line stopped, we obviously started having to write our own canon, our own changes to the world and the things that happened. I'm going to review most of those things. Because the 90s pretty much followed the books identically, I'm only going to cover a couple of quick things of the changes. Mostly I'm going to tell you who the Justicars were in the 90s before the book Children of the Night came out, which detailed who the Justicars of the Camarilla were in 1998 going forward. And then One World followed that exactly. The original Justicars in One World by Night for Bruja was known as Masako. Malkavian was known as Lucian. Tremere was known as Malafar. The Ventru was Robert Petter. Toreador was Madame Guy. Nosferatu was Sarnov. And Gangrel was Xavier. Several of those are canon. Only really Petter, Madame Guy, and Xavier were made up for One World. The other ones were. And then when the book came out that showed who the Justicars were, because in 2nd edition they didn't really detail who the Justicars were, we changed over to that. And as I said, we followed much of the same canon as the books. In the revised edition, the Gangrel left the Camarilla. They did in One World by Night as well in the 90s and early 2000s. The Tremere and Tree of the Sabbat all died, just like they did in the books. The Week of Nightmares occurred in One World by Night as well. The Awakening of Urshulgi for the Assamites and the Schism happened. The Red Star appearing in the sky in the time of Thin Blood, that absolutely occurred. The Sabbat War along the East Coast mostly occurred. It wasn't quite as successful as there were games there, and we weren't going to force them to just suddenly be Sabbat. Another key example is New York City in itself. In the White Wolf canon, fell to the Camarilla. It was originally Sabbat. In One World by Night, that never happened. New York City is still very much Sabbat and is very much the game I run, so it will be staying Sabbat. We also ran what's called Ends of Empire. That was the end of Wraith the Oblivion with the Sixth Great Maelstrom devastating their society. We also ran the effects that had on the vampire world, and particularly necromancers, the rising of the dead, think The Walking Dead, that happened. We also ran the Children of Osiris These were a bloodline of vampires, Egyptian-based, that opposed the followers of Set, and their founder woke up, who was a mummy, and turned them all back into mortals. Of course, we have the Red List as well. This is the kindred's most wanted among the Camarilla. They're hunted across the world. Our list differs. Some of them have died. There are some vacancies. There's even some PCs, player characters, that have made the Red List in One World by Night. So that's the basic kind of changes. There aren't many from the canon that happened. In the early 2000s, there wasn't too much deviation from White Wolf canon. Not a lot of major things were run across the entirety of the org. There was some stuff here and there, but nothing overarching, kind of like the Week of Nightmares or major, what we call meta plot changes. The biggest thing at the time, Camarilla Vampire, was the predominant games in the organization. So the big ones you're going to look for there is called Conclave Decisions. Conclaves are large gatherings of vampires in the Camarilla, and they come together and make decisions that can change the entirety of the sect. And every year they had one of those. And so important decisions were made that differentiate from the canon of the books. The Camarilla One World by Night wiki has a great link that details you all of the decisions of the conclaves that was made, where to find those, what those mean, and the changes that they've done as a result of that. And that'll take you pretty close up to almost 2010. There were some, obviously, minutiae and clan changes and things like that, but nothing huge and overarching was done really during that time. Again, consult your packets. They'll have any details and changes and information in there. Of course, you can also ask the historian cord, things like that. In 2010, though, we ran our first major organization-wide meta-plot. In the past, for White Wolf books, they would have themed years, like Year of the Lotus, Year of Reckoning, Year of the Fallen. These were all major story events every year, and we decided to run that ourselves. We did one called the Year of Fire. And the Year of Fire had to do with the return of an ancient vampire named Moloch. He was one of the founders of the very infamous Bali bloodline, a group of vampires that worship and gain power from demons, and generally seek to do bad things to the world, return their dark masters, things like that. And for a whole year, he and his brood rampaged across the world. Infernalism spread across the area, and we broke this down into 4 major LARP events. One that you could go to with your character for each one if you wanted to kind of follow the continuation of the story of why is this happening, how to stop him, what's going on. And we introduced new factions of vampires seeking to oppose or aid him in his goals. At the end of which, one of the key factors was the signing of the Convention of Fire. This ended the global hostilities between the Sabbat and the Camarilla. It was no longer a hot war, but a cold war. Little conflicts can exist between games, but overall, the Camarilla and the Sabbat put their differences aside to deal with a much greater threat and problem. That was really kicked off at the Grand Masquerade thrown by White Wolf in 2010, and largely kind of concluded in around 2011 to 2012. That was still a plot that had great impact over that time. You know, the afterfall of how does the Camarilla and the Sabbat work together? When do they work together? What are the rules for that? But ultimately, on an out-of-character level, it was designed so that players of those factions could interact more than just I'm going to kill your character base. It was so that they could tell stories together, they could role play together. It's not something that should be common or happen every day, but on rare occasions allows those things to occur, when before they weren't. They just were not. And then about 2015 up until 2019-20, we tried again with another story called The Year of Smoke. This one was a bit more nebulous as to what was going on, the origins of it, but ultimately what it broke down to is these mysterious creatures appeared in the world and wanted to kill all the vampires. And that story overfolded over many years as to where these creatures came from. They were, some vampires believed that they were the mythical flood that appears in the Bible. that had wiped away all vampires previously and do it continuously. It asks questions of what is the nature of Gehenna, also known as kind of the end of the world. Ultimately, it was taken over by the Malkavian coordinator, who did a fantastic job. I'm not going to go into too much detail on that, as there's still some things being run with it, but it has to do with the history and mythos surrounding Clan Malkavian. Ultimately, at the end, had some major changes as well with the awakening of ancient vampires, things like that. Other major events: the Assamites are still vying for a Justicar within the Camarilla. The Gangrel ended up rejoining the Camarilla in One World by Night, so they have their own Justicar again. They're no longer solely independent vampires. Let's see what else happened. The Sabbat had its fourth civil war that occurred, which resulted in a new regent, Regent Radu Bistri, who is the current regent of the Sabbat at the moment, barring any specific changes that happen there. But largely, One World follows most of the canon. Anything from 4th edition, also known as V20, or BNS, By Night Studios, or 5th edition, are not used in One World by Night unless specifically spelled out by a coordinator in a plot. These plots are usually, each coordinator will generally once a year propose a plot that hyper-focuses on the thing they coordinate over. Like I said, every once in a while we've done two, the Year of Fire and Year of Smoke. You can get an org-wide meta plot that affects everyone. And then, of course, the Garou have their own history. That's the werewolves, mages, all of that. And sometimes it intersects, but largely is separate when it comes to story issues. For any other really larger changes, like I said, I would check your packets. You can always feel free to hit me up and ask me what the difference is here. A lot of it can relate to games control having their games in canon territory compared to their city book. Like the Chicago game is not going to match the Chicago tabletop book. It'd probably have some useful things in it, but you'd want to talk to them and what the differences are. So those are kind of major differences. Key things is that the Gehenna Crusade of 5th edition didn't happen. The Second Inquisition of 5th edition didn't happen. Not yet anyways, unless someone props those. The breaking of the Tremere, the Camarilla, all that stuff from 5th edition is not anything we use at this time. That could change. If someone wanted to prop to use those canon materials, council would vote on it and decide if that's a story we want to tell. Ultimately as well, you want to check out Timeline on the OWBN website, or ask the historian as well. As a few of us old players still in this organization that can probably answer your questions, and hopefully give you any differences between the canon changes and where One World's at. Like I said previously, this is an ongoing story since 1995. The organization does not do resets, so you don't have to worry about that. And then again, if you don't really particularly care for the canon of One World by Night or White Wolf, you can pretty much skip all of that. Covered the major beat points of things that you would need to know. If you want to just learn everything else in character, you absolutely can. So yeah, that about summarizes the history of the canon changes of One World by Night. The history of the organization itself, like I said, started in 1995 with a couple of games coming together and then more and more games joining the organization. We used to have games in Europe, the Middle East. We still have games in Canada and Brazil. So yeah, the organization continues to grow, get new games and players, which is the ultimate goal. And yeah, the history is ever changing, and you can help change what it is going forward. You help tell this story. All right, I'll see you guys next episode, where we're going to kind of cover mechanics. It's probably going to be a long one. Have a good one. Bye.